Barry Gibb, the legendary giant of pop music, he is the golden thread that wove harmony into the hearts of the entire world. He is the voice that turned falsetto into fire, the pen that carved eternal ballads, the genius who gave humanity Stayin' Alive and How Deep Is Your Love, songs that will live on for centuries. From a childhood weighed down by poverty and the fiery scar of an accident that nearly claimed his life, he rose from nothing to stand among the greatest songwriters in history, selling hundreds of millions of records and defining an entire era of music. He is Sir Barry Gibb, knighted by the British Crown for his art, honored across continents, and cherished as the soul of the Bee Gees, the band that defined a generation. His name has been etched into the temple of music's eternal glory. But every triumph has been paid for with unimaginable tragedy. The unbearable pain of burying three beloved brothers, carrying alone the harmony that once needed four voices, a marriage collapse, and the crushing weight of illness closing in. And now, at nearly 80 years old, the last man standing walks through the darkness of loneliness and grief. Before we begin, don't forget to hit like as a gesture of tribute to the extraordinary talent and unbreakable spirit that gave everything to the world. It is cruel beyond words. Barry Gibb's life began not with applause, but with scars. Born on September 1, 1946, at the Jane Crookall maternity home on the Isle of Man, he arrived into a family of little means but endless hope. His father, Hugh, was a drummer who scraped together coins playing in seaside hotels, often returning home at dawn with nothing but exhaustion in his pockets. His mother, Barbara, juggled a growing brood with grit, tenderness, and silent tears when money ran out. Barry was the second child, following his sister Leslie, and by December 1949, the family would welcome twins Robin and Maurice. Despite poverty, the house overflowed with love. A father who filled the air with rhythm, a mother who wrapped her children in warmth, and siblings who laughed together in cramped rented rooms. Yet behind this fragile joy lurked tragedy. When Barry was not yet 2 years old, he reached for a teapot, and it tipped. Boiling water cascaded across his tiny body. He screamed, and in a heartbeat, the house erupted in panic. Barbara rushed to him, burning her own hands as she tried to strip the soaked clothes from his skin. Leslie, still a little girl herself, stood frozen in terror as Hugh scooped Barry into his arms and ran through the streets to Noble's Hospital. There, doctors whispered he had less than half an hour to live. "We were told he had 20 minutes, Barbara later remembered, her heart breaking. The burns covered his torso, his arms, his neck. Infection set in, even gangrene crept dangerously close. For 2.5 months, Barbara kept vigil by his bed, refusing to leave even when nurses urged her to rest. Hugh, shattered, played drums at night to keep food on the table, then sat silently beside his son's frail body by day. They were a family on the edge, one child fighting for life in the hospital, another waiting anxiously at home, and two parents stretched between fear and survival. And yet, he fought. Against the odds, the little boy clung to life. He survived. When Barry finally came home, his family carried him as if he were made of glass. Barbara kissed the scars as though she could heal them. Leslie brought him toys, trying to make him smile again. His father would drum softly at his bedside to soothe him to sleep. But the accident had left its mark. Across his chest and arms, the burns had twisted the skin into ridges and patches, a permanent map of fire that would never fade. The boy who should have died became the boy who lived, carrying not just wounds, but the memory of being held, protected, and loved when the world nearly took him away. I have no memory of that time, only the marks that never left me, Barry later recalled. His body was bent by scars, but his spirit was lifted by the devotion of those around him. The burns became not only a reminder of suffering, but of survival, of family, and of the fierce love that kept him alive. But fate was merciless. At just 4 years old, Barry faced another cruel shadow. One afternoon, a stranger tried to lure him away, speaking and acting in ways no child should ever be exposed to. It terrified him so deeply that the police became involved, forcing Barry, still only a little boy, to describe what had happened with words far too heavy for someone his age. He later clarified that he was never physically harmed, but the experience left scars of another kind. The shame, the confusion, the fear that someone had wanted to hurt him. It was frightening. A moment I could never forget, he admitted years later, his voice still heavy with memory. If the burns had scarred his body, this encounter scarred his spirit. Yet even amid fear and frailty, the Gibb family clung to one another with fierce love. Barbara wiped her tears so her children wouldn't see. Hugh kept drumming through exhaustion to bring in pennies. The siblings huddled close, their laughter echoing in tiny rented cottages. But instability was relentless. From Chapel House to St. Catherine's Drive in 1949, to Snell Road in 1952, and finally to Manchester in 1955, their belongings were packed and unpacked so often that Barry grew up wondering if any place would ever feel permanent. He remembered his mother crying quietly when his father's gigs fell through, his father returning home exhausted from nights of drumming for drunks. They were never homeless, but never secure. A child should have felt carefree. Instead, Barry carried the ache of instability, the weight of uncertainty, and the strange responsibility to turn pain into something more. And in that pain, something miraculous stirred. Music became his refuge, his only constant. Hugh's drums rattled through the cramped rooms, and Barry, barely 6, began humming melodies like whispered prayers. He discovered that sound could drown out hunger, harmony could silence fear, and a song could make even the darkest night feel less heavy. With Robin and Maurice beside him, the 3 brothers often sang together in the small house, their young voices weaving a promise no one yet understood. Even then, Barry carried the instinct of a survivor, to transform agony into song, scars into strength, shadows into fire. The world would one day call him a giant, but first he was only a fragile child marked by burns and fear, lifted by love and forged by struggle. His body carried the scars, his soul carried the shadows, and both became the raw material of a voice that shook the earth. His scars became his strength, his fear became his fire, and his hunger became his harmony. The first notes of a symphony of survival that was only just beginning. The boy with scars was no longer a fragile child. He was a teenager who had learned that if he wanted to keep breathing, he had to sing. The burns had hardened his skin, the fear had haunted his soul, but poverty scarred every single day of his youth. And so Barry Gibb grew up with 3 constant companions: hunger, instability, and music. For him, music wasn't a pastime. It wasn't even a dream. It was survival. By 1957, at just 11 years old, Barry gathered his younger brothers Robin and Maurice and a few neighborhood friends to form their first group, the Rattlesnakes. They weren't chasing stardom, they were chasing escape. Singing Everly Brothers and Buddy Holly covers, they filled tiny halls with harmonies that sounded bigger than their bodies, their voices carrying hopes far heavier than their years. But even this fragile dream cracked. One evening, Barry's guitar split in two. The wood broke clean through the middle, a sound sharper than applause, a sound that felt like hope itself, snapping in half. They couldn't afford a new one. The rattlesnakes dissolved, and for a moment it seemed the music would dissolve too. But Barry refused to let it die. With Robin and Maurice still beside him, he rose again, renaming the band Wee Johnny Hayes and the Blue Cats. They played in talent contests where the prize was not fame, but food, bread and coins, the currency of survival. Then came the greatest gamble. In August 1958, the Gibb family boarded the ship Fair Sea, part of an assisted migration program that promised a new life in Australia. They left behind almost everything. Possessions crammed into a handful of battered suitcases, the rest abandoned. Children slept on crowded decks. Mothers prayed against seasickness. Fathers smoked quietly against the salt air, wondering if they had made the right choice. For Barry, the answer would come later, but at the time he knew only this. They were poor in England, and they were still poor at sea. Australia did not welcome them with riches. It greeted them with the same hunger, the same struggle, only on hotter soil. By 1959, the brothers were singing at the Redcliffe Speedway. The air reeked of gasoline, dust stung their eyes, and engines roared so loud the earth shook. No spotlight, no stage, just three boys standing in the dirt, waiting for a break between races. We sang between the races, Barry would later recall, with dust in our eyes and petrol in our lungs. At first, the crowd barely noticed, but then their harmonies rose, slicing through the roar of the machines, and for a fleeting moment, the noise fell silent. People turned. People listened. It wasn't glamour. It wasn't money. But it was survival. By 1961, Barry was 15 and knew the truth. School could not save them. Music had to. He walked away from classrooms, from textbooks, from any semblance of childhood, and threw himself into songwriting. "I knew if I stayed in school, we'd starve," he admitted. Night after night, he filled notebooks with lyrics, melodies scribbled like prayers, songs built out of hunger and hope. While other boys dreamed of exams, Barry dreamed of saving his family, carrying them out of poverty, one song at a time. The breakthrough came in 1963, when the brothers signed with Festival Records in Sydney. At first, they were dismissed, relegated to a minor label, ignored by executives. But Barry's pen would not be silenced. He wrote song after song, until radio stations had no choice but to listen. By 1966, his composition, "I Was a Lover, a Leader of Men," won a major songwriting award. It was not just recognition. It was proof that the boy with scars, the boy who had sung in the dust and the gasoline, was now a man whose music could no longer be ignored. But the price was high. He was still only a teenager, yet childhood had ended too soon. He had traded it for microphones, for melodies, for the impossible burden of saving everyone he loved. His scars had become his strength, his fear had become his fire, and his hunger had become his harmony. And from those ashes of struggle, Barry Gibb had forged not just songs, but survival itself. By 1967, the boy who once sang between car races in the dust of Redcliffe Speedway now stepped onto the grand stages of London. Barry Gibb and his brothers had returned to England, clutching a handful of demos, uncertain but unbroken. They met Robert Stigwood, a manager with vision, who saw in them not just talent, but destiny. And almost overnight, the Bee Gees became a force that no one could ignore. Their first UK single, New York Mining Disaster 1941, slid onto the charts with a melody so haunting that listeners swore it must be the Beatles in disguise. Then came Massachusetts, To Love Somebody. Words, songs that sounded like prayers set to music, dripping with longing and soul. The world had found a new voice of heartbreak, and that voice belonged to Barry Gibb. For a moment, it seemed as if every scar, every night of hunger, every uncertain step had finally led them to salvation. Critics hailed Barry as a prodigy. Crowds screamed their names. Stages overflowed with applause. But applause can be deceiving. Behind the thunder of adoration came the quiet, suffocating sound of exhaustion. The brothers were barely in their 20s, yet they were touring endlessly, recording without pause, pushed by the unforgiving machinery of fame. By the late 1960s, Barry and Robin collapsed from sheer fatigue while flying between continents. Their bodies were breaking, and worse, their unity was too. And the cracks widened. The harmony that had once saved them now turned into a battlefield. Robin, with his fragile pride and soaring vibrato, felt increasingly overshadowed by Barry's deep authority and natural command as the eldest. When the group chose Barry's 1st of May over Robin's beloved Lamplight as their next single, it was more than a business decision. It was a wound to the heart. Robin later admitted, "I felt invisible, like my voice didn't matter anymore." In 1969, he walked away. One of the 3 pillars of the Bee Gees had crumbled, and the House of Harmony collapsed with it. Barry tried to carry on with Maurice, but the magic dimmed. Alone, he poured himself into a solo project with a title that seemed like a cruel whisper of his own doubts, "The Kid's No Good." "It felt like the world was telling me I wasn't enough without them," Barry reflected years later. He released "I'll Kiss Your Memory," a tender ballad meant to soar. But it failed, ignored in the UK and the US, flickering briefly in the Netherlands before fading into silence. The rest of the album was shelved, gathering dust like a broken dream. For the first time, Barry tasted the bitter truth. Even brilliance can be silenced when it loses its harmony. Meanwhile, Robin chased his own solo path, carrying equal parts pride and sorrow. "We weren't just a band, we were brothers, and yet I couldn't stand beside them then. I thought leaving was freedom, but it felt like exile," Robin confessed later. The air between the brothers grew colder than ever. Barry admitted with regret, "We were still brothers, but we weren't together anymore." The glances that once said everything now became silence. The bond that once required no words was replaced by words too sharp to take back. And yet, even in exile, blood still pulled at them. By late 1970, something shifted. Nostalgia, fate, or perhaps the unbreakable thread of brotherhood. They returned to the studio, hesitant, wounded, but together. Out of that fragile reunion came Lonely Days and How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, songs carved directly from their own fracture. The latter soared to #1 in America, their first US chart topper. To the world, it was a triumph. But to the brothers, it was a confession set to melody. The pain of nearly losing each other forever. From that moment on, the Bee Gees' music was no longer just about fame or melody. Every harmony carried the weight of wounds. Every chorus whispered both love and regret. They were brothers who loved each other fiercely, but also hurt each other deeply. And Barry, always the eldest, always the leader, carried the heaviest burden, knowing that the very gift that bound them together could just as easily tear them apart. He had climbed into the spotlight, but it came at a terrible cost. Sleepless nights, bitter arguments, the collapse of his dream to stand alone. Stardom had arrived, but hand in hand with fracture. The scars on his body had faded into memory, but now new scars, emotional, invisible, indelible, were etched into his soul. And buried in those scars lay the timeless lesson that no stage, no fame, no applause could ever outweigh the fragile bond of family. From the scars of a boy who once nearly died from boiling water came a voice that would set fire to the world. By 1974, the Gibb brothers left England and planted themselves in Miami, a city of reinvention. Under producer Arif Mardin's guidance, Barry stumbled upon the sound that would transform both his life and popular music, the falsetto. What began as a scream of desperation in rehearsal became survival, became identity. It wasn't planned, it just came out, and suddenly it was who we were, Barry later reflected. His soaring falsetto was not merely a note, it was a resurrection. The Bee Gees, once dismissed as relics of the 60s, were reborn as titans. Hits poured like a flood. Jive Talkin', Nights on Broadway, You Should Be Dancing. Clubs pulsed to their rhythm, radio stations surrendered. By 1977, with the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack selling over 40 million copies, the Bee Gees were no longer a band. They were a phenomenon. Stayin' Alive, Night Fever, How Deep Is Your Love, these weren't just songs, they were anthems that defined a generation. For a time, Barry Gibb's falsetto was the most inescapable sound on earth. Yet even as the crown of kings of disco sat heavy on their heads, shadows crept in. Fame filled bank accounts, but drained spirits. Barry was writing not only for the Bee Gees, but for others. Barbra Streisand's Woman in Love, Dionne Warwick's Heartbreaker, Kenny Rogers, and Dolly Parton's Islands in the Stream. His pen was relentless, his voice tireless. But Platinum Records masked sleepless nights, fractured family bonds, and the crushing weight of sustaining an empire. You can be on top of the world and still feel alone, Barry admitted. For every ovation outside, there was silence inside hotel rooms. And then, the empire cracked. By the dawn of the 1980s, love turned to loathing. The very falsetto once worshipped was mocked in parodies. The songs that had lifted millions became symbols of disdain. The Disco Sucks movement tore across America, with stadiums erupting as Bee Gees records were smashed and burned. Crowds once chanting "Stayin' Alive" were now shouting for disco to die. It felt like we'd gone from heroes to villains overnight, Barry later confessed. In 1981, the Bee Gees released Living Eyes, stripped of disco gloss, aching to prove they were more than a fad. But the public had turned away. The album failed, the stages shrank, the applause died. For Barry, it was not just rejection, it was betrayal. To pour every wound, every scar, every ounce of survival into music, only to be spat back, was a pain deeper than fire. And yet he did not stop. He became the invisible architect behind other people's triumphs, crafting timeless hits, even if his name was hidden in the credits. He was still a hit machine, a master whose melodies stitched themselves into the fabric of lives worldwide. But in the quiet, the ache remained. To be adored and abandoned, crowned and crucified. This was a scar no falsetto could disguise. The story of Miami to the 1980s was not just about music. It was about rise and fall, glory and grief, devotion and betrayal. Barry had turned scars into falsetto, pain into platinum. But the price was steep. The applause that once lifted him now left him hollow. And though he kept writing, singing, surviving, one truth remained. Fame will always fade, but the songs, born of fire, hunger, and love, will outlive the noise. The world had already turned its back on him, but nothing could prepare Barry for the wound that came next. If the sting of public rejection had cut him, the next blow would shatter him completely, for it came not from strangers, but from his own blood. It is cruel beyond words. Barry Gibb's first great loss was the youngest of them all, Andy Gibb. The baby of the family, 12 years Barry's junior, Andy was not just a little brother. To Barry, he was almost a son. He had carried Andy on his shoulders as a child, cradled him when he cried, placed a guitar in his small hands, and watched the boy's eyes widen with wonder as music flowed through their modest home. Barry often called him my baby brother, but the words meant more than bloodlines. They carried the weight of devotion, pride, and a protector's love. By the late 1970s, Andy was no longer just the kid chasing after his older brothers. He was a star in his own right, with a boyish grin and a velvet voice that melted radios around the world. Hits like I Just Want to Be Your Everything and Shadow Dancing made him an overnight sensation. The youngest Gibb suddenly basking in the same glow that had once crowned the Bee Gees. And behind much of it was Barry, producing, writing, guiding. He gave Andy the songs, the stage, the spotlight. It was as if Barry had handed his little brother wings and whispered, "Fly." But fame, that seductive and merciless mistress, wrapped around Andy too soon, too tight. Barely out of his teens, he was thrust into a world of wealth, temptation, and loneliness. The whirlwind swallowed him. Drugs and alcohol, always lurking in the shadows of stardom, found him vulnerable. Barry saw it happening. He called, he counseled, he carried Andy through rehab visits, tried to anchor him when the current dragged too strong. Yet still, the spiral deepened. "I sometimes think I pushed him too hard," Barry would later confess, voice trembling with regret. What was meant as brotherly guidance sometimes felt like pressure, and Barry carried that weight like a stone pressed to his heart. On March 10, 1988, just 5 days after celebrating his 30th birthday, Andy's heart gave out. The doctors called it myocarditis, but the truth was undeniable. Years of abuse had weakened him beyond repair. The news shattered Barry. His baby brother, the one he had lifted into the light, was gone before life had even truly begun. At the funeral, grief became unbearable theater. Barry stood broken, his face carved with pain, his hand trembling on Andy's photograph as if willing it to breathe again. Their mother, Barbara, clutched that same photo to her chest, sobbing so violently that relatives feared she would collapse beside the coffin. You, the proud drummer who had once kept the family alive with rhythm, now sat hunched in silence, his calloused hands shaking as if even the beat of life had deserted him. Robin and Maurice, the twins who had grown up in perfect harmony with their youngest brother, stood side by side yet wordless. Robin's eyes fixed on the coffin as if trying to sing silently to Andy one last time. Maurice, gripping the pew so tightly his knuckles blanched. Even Leslie, the eldest sister, wept uncontrollably, her sobs echoing through the church like broken notes of a song that could never be sung again. Witnesses recalled the sight of parents burying their youngest child, while their eldest stood beside them, voiceless, shattered, and the siblings who once filled the air with music, now reduced to silence. The man who could fill stadiums with falsetto could not summon a single note. For once, silence conquered the singer. Later, Barry would reflect with aching honesty. "It doesn't matter how many people love you. If you don't love yourself, it can all slip away." That truth was carved from tragedy. Andy's fall was not just the end of a young star, it was the first great crack in the harmony of the Gibb family. To the world, Andy was a teen idol lost too soon. To Barry, he was the child he had once held, the brother he had once promised to protect, and the dream he could not save. For years after, Andy's absence haunted him. In interviews, Barry's voice faltered when Andy's name surfaced. On stage, every note carried the ghost of a younger brother whose voice had been stilled forever. "I'll never stop thinking about him," Barry admitted, eyes clouded with memory. And so Andy's death became more than a family tragedy. It was a wound that never healed, a reminder that even for a man who had survived fire, betrayal, and fame, grief could burn deeper than any scar. Andy's passing in 1988 was the beginning of Barry's darkest chapter. He had survived childhood flames, survived the world's scorn, but nothing prepared him for burying his baby brother at 30. And yet, as fate would prove, this was only the first of many blows. The harmony of 4 voices was now 3, and heartbreakingly, even that would not last. Only a few years later, fate struck again. Barry had barely begun to carry the weight of Andy's absence when another blow tore through him. This time, the loss of his father, Hugh Gibb, in 1992. To the world, Hugh's passing was the quiet end of an aging man. But to Barry, it was the collapse of the foundation beneath his feet. Hugh was not just a father. He was the first rhythm Barry ever knew. The steady hands on the drums that had kept a hungry family alive in the Isle of Man. The man who had carried their dream long before the world cared to listen. Barry could still remember lying awake as a boy in cheap boarding houses, hearing the faint echo of his father's drums drifting through thin walls. Each beat was a promise that somehow they would endure. Those rhythms had stitched the family together in nights of poverty and uncertainty. And now, that rhythm had fallen silent. Barbara's grief was uncontainable. She had already buried her youngest child, and now she buried the man who had stood beside her through every hardship. Robin and Maurice bowed their heads in sorrow, feeling the weight of yet another fracture in the family harmony. For Barry, the loss was unbearable in a different way. Andy's death had been like watching a star fall too soon, but losing Hugh was like watching the earth itself crumble. One was tragedy, the other was foundation. Together, they left him hollow. He pressed on with music, smiling for the cameras, but in private, he felt the truth. The family that once filled every room with sound was being dismantled, piece by piece. And Barry, as the eldest, bore the unshakable sense that it was now his duty to keep alive not only the music, but the memory of the man who had first given him rhythm. If Andy's death had torn Barry's heart, Maurice's was a blow that shattered the very ground beneath his feet. It came without warning, so sudden, so cruel, that it felt almost unreal. Maurice Gibb, the quiet force who had so often held his brothers together, walked into a Miami hospital complaining of nothing more than stomach pain. It seemed routine, harmless even, something that a night of rest or a minor procedure might cure. But fate is fragile, and life more fleeting than we ever dare believe. Within hours, everything collapsed. Doctors discovered a severe intestinal blockage, surgery was ordered, and then, in a merciless twist, Maurice's heart stopped beating. The man known as the glue of the Bee Gees, the soul who held fire and storm in balance, was gone at just 53. For Barry, the news struck like thunder in a clear sky. Maurice had always been the steady one, the peacemaker when tempers flared, the laughter when silence grew heavy, the anchor when the tides of fame pulled too hard. If Barry was the fire and Robin the storm, Maurice was the ground beneath their feet. He wasn't just a brother, he was balance itself, the invisible harmony that turned chaos into music. And in a single night, that harmony was ripped away forever. Barry could not take it in. He replayed the sequence endlessly in disbelief. A stomach ache, a hospital visit, a surgery, and then silence. No long illness to prepare for, no fading farewell, only the unbearable contrast of yesterday's laughter and today's coffin. In later interviews, his voice faltered as he admitted, "It was so sudden, I couldn't take it in." That confession carried the weight of shock, denial, and the cruel realization that even the strongest bonds can vanish in an instant. Maurice's death was not only personal grief, it was the collapse of an empire. The Bee Gees had survived poverty, exile, the disco backlash, even their own quarrels. And through it all, Maurice was the calm in the storm, the one who quietly stitched the family back together when it frayed. Without him, the very chemistry that defined their sound disintegrated. The group that had once sold over 200 million records, the voices behind Stayin' Alive and How Deep Is Your Love, could no longer exist. The harmony of three had been reduced to two, and with it, the unspoken magic was gone. For Barry, this loss was more than another wound. It was a revelation of life's fragility. He had already buried Andy, then Hugh, and now Maurice. Each death carved a deeper scar, but Maurice's passing left him truly shaken. It was a reminder that even at the height of glory, life can be undone by something as small as pain in the stomach, as sudden as the stopping of a heart. And in the months that followed, the weight of absence became unbearable in the simplest moments. In rehearsals, Barry would catch himself glancing toward the space Maurice once filled, only to see an empty chair and feel the silence pressing in. On stage, the harmonies rang thinner, like a tapestry torn at its center. The laughter, the quiet nods, the unspoken chemistry, they were gone, leaving only echoes. Standing in that silence, Barry came to understand a truth that would haunt him forever. The music may live on, but the brothers who made it would never again stand side by side. If Maurice's death had been a thunderclap, sudden and brutal, Robin's was a slow eclipse, a darkness that crept in day after day until it swallowed the light completely. By the late 2000s, Robin Gibb, Barry's twin brother in song if not in birth, was diagnosed with cancer of the colon and liver. At first there was hope. Doctors spoke of treatments, of remissions, of time bought. Robin clung to that hope with the stubborn will of a man who had lived his life on stage. There were days when his voice returned, thin but defiant, and Barry dared to believe they might still write one last song together. But hope turned cruel. Slowly, inexorably, the disease advanced. His frame shrank, his voice faltered, and the eyes that had once sparkled with wit and music clouded with pain. Barry could only watch, powerless, as the brother who had shared his soul in harmony for half a century was unmade note by note. At Robin's bedside, Barry sat for hours, holding his hand as if clinging to the last thread of harmony. He whispered memories of childhood streets, of songs scribbled in tiny flats, of nights when their voices felt like one. Sometimes he would hum a line of "How Deep Is Your Love," waiting for Robin to join in, but silence answered. "We'll sing again," Barry promised, though his heart already knew the silence would soon be forever. Their history had been marked by fire and forgiveness. In 1969, Robin walked away from the Bee Gees when his song Lamplight was passed over for Barry's 1st of May. For months, they did not speak, their silence louder than applause. "We were still brothers," Barry later recalled, "but we weren't together anymore." And yet, they found their way back. From that reconciliation came "How Can You Mend a Broken Heart," a song that now felt like prophecy. They had fought, forgiven, reconciled, and redeemed. That made the final parting all the more merciless. Barry was not just losing a brother, he was losing the man who had challenged him, forgiven him, and completed him. On May 20th, 2012, Robin Gibb's voice fell silent at the age of 62. For the world, it was the closing of a chapter. For Barry, it was the collapse of the foundation of his life. The Bee Gees had endured mockery, disco backlash, exhaustion, even their own breakups, but they could not survive death. The last chord of their harmony had been struck. The funeral was a cathedral of sorrow. Fans lined the streets, holding vinyl sleeves like sacred relics. Inside, Robin's coffin was carried to the haunting strains of "I Started a Joke." A song once written as irony now sounded like prophecy, its words cutting like fate itself. Barry stood pale, immobile, his eyes fixed on the coffin as if begging it to open. His falsetto, the voice that once soared above disco lights, was silent. At his side, their mother, Barbara, frail with age, clutched Robin's photograph to her chest, sobbing so violently mourners feared she might fall beside her son. It was the third child she had buried. Her cries were no longer just a mother's grief. They were the lament of a family undone by destiny. When the last note faded, Barry walked into a world that felt unbearably alien. He had become, in his own words, the last man standing. To the public, it sounded like triumph. To Barry, it felt like a punishment. Back in Miami, guitars lined his walls like ghosts. Friends recalled him strumming a chord, then stopping, staring into the silence where harmony should have been. "The hardest thing," he confessed, "is knowing the harmony is gone. Forever." Robin's death was more than the loss of a brother. It was the end of a duet that had defined an era. It taught Barry and the world a brutal truth, that no matter how deep the love, no matter how strong the bond, even the closest ties can be cut by time and fate. Life, he realized, is more fragile than applause, more fleeting than fame. One day you are laughing with your brother. The next, you are standing beside his coffin. And so Barry carried on, not because he wanted to, but because someone had to. Alone on stage, he would glance to his right and left, still expecting Robin or Maurice to be there to catch the note. Instead, there was only empty space, a silence heavier than any roar of applause. The Bee Gees had begun as harmony between brothers. Now, it was memory carried by one man. Barry Gibb survived, but survival, he came to understand, was not victory. It was the cruelest fate of all. And through his grief, his story became a lesson carved in music and in silence. Forgive sooner, love deeper, and hold your family close, because no one knows which song will be the last. But life, which had already stolen so much, was not finished. Its final cruelty would come when it took Barbara, the mother who had been his anchor through every storm. She had always been there. Through every rise, every fall, every record sung, and every coffin lowered, Barbara was the constant, the quiet strength that stitched the Gibb family together. Barry had watched her endure the unendurable, the searing agony of outliving 3 of her sons, the sight of Andy's youthful spark extinguished, the shock of Maurice gone overnight, the long, cruel fade of Robin. Through it all, she clung to him, the eldest, the last thread of her once vibrant tapestry. In her presence, Barry could still feel that somewhere, somehow, the family was not entirely gone. And then she, too, slipped away. There was no sudden crisis, no stage lights dimming, no headlines screaming. It was simply the slow closing of the final chapter. With Barbara's passing, Barry was left not only brotherless, but motherless, the last survivor of the family that had given the world its music. The silence that followed was deeper than anything applause or melody could mask. For Barry, It was not just losing his mother. It was losing the last witness to his beginnings. Barbara was the one who had held his tiny body when boiling water nearly took his life, who sat beside his hospital bed for months, who whispered encouragement when gigs failed and food ran short. She was the one who had kissed his scars, soothed his fears, and reminded him, even in the darkest hours of fame's backlash, that he was still her son. Without her, there was no one left who remembered the boy before the legend, the child before the star. In private moments, Barry admitted the weight of it. "I feel like the last leaf on the tree," he once said. Every guitar on his wall now echoed with ghosts. Every note he sang was haunted by the memory of voices that would never return. Sometimes he would gaze at an old family photograph, 5 children huddled close around Barbara's gentle smile, and whisper words only she could hear, as though reaching across the silence. To the world, Barry Gibb remained a knighted icon, a legend who survived when so many others did not. But within, he carried the unbearable truth that survival is not always triumph. Sometimes it is the cruelest fate, to stand alone where once there was a chorus of love. But death was not the only thief in Barry's life. Love, too, had once slipped painfully through his fingers. Long before the world called him a legend, Barry was just a boy with nothing but a guitar, a dream, and a fragile belief that love could offer shelter. In 1966, barely 20, he married Maureen Bates in a modest ceremony far from the blinding lights of fame. It was not glamour that bound them, but youth, a desperate hope for stability in a life already battered by poverty and struggle. For Barry, who had grown up watching his parents scrape to keep food on the table, marriage felt like a sanctuary, a promise that he could build something steady while chasing the uncertain future of music. But dreams and reality often collide. The Bee Gees' sudden rise in the late 1960s hurled Barry into a tempest of fame. Tours that spanned continents, endless nights in recording studios, and the merciless glare of spotlights. What began as tenderness between 2 young hearts soon cracked under distance, exhaustion, and the unrelenting demands of ambition. Maureen, who had once pictured a quiet life, found herself eclipsed, a shadow in the brilliance of Barry's ascent. They had no children to bind them, no home sturdy enough to anchor them, and by 1970, just 4 years later, the marriage dissolved. Quietly, without public scandal, but with private sorrow, their paths diverged. Barry rarely spoke of those years, burying the memory beneath the avalanche of Bee Gees' triumphs, but in rare moments, the regret seeped through. "We were too young," he confessed softly. "Too young to grasp the weight of forever. Too unprepared for how fame could devour intimacy." For Barry, the cost was not measured in money. There was no fortune yet to divide. But in something far heavier, the loss of a love he could not hold on to. And yet, from the ashes of that broken union, a lesson endured. He learned that applause could not warm an empty home, that even the loudest ovations could not fill the silence of a bed left cold. He carried that scar quietly, letting it remind him that love, like life, is fragile, and that devotion requires more than passion. It requires endurance. The world would later know him as a man transformed, a husband whose 50-year devotion to Linda Gray became one of Hollywood's rarest love stories. That enduring marriage would not have been possible without the pain of the first, a fracture that taught Barry the value of steadfastness. Still, the memory of Maureen remained an echo in the long corridor of his life, a reminder that even legends stumble, that even the strongest voices can falter, and that true love, when it comes, must be cherished. because it does not come twice. But love, unlike fame, does not come without storms. And if Barry Gibb had once known the pain of love slipping away, it was Linda Gray who proved that love could endure, heal, and even save him when nothing else could. They met in 1967, in the glow of early fame. Barry was barely 21. Linda, a young woman crowned Miss Edinburgh. Radiant, yet steady in a way that made Barry feel seen not as a star, but as a man. They married in 1970, and their home would soon be filled with 5 children: Stephen, Ashley, Travis, Michael, and Alexandra. To the outside world, it looked like a fairy tale. A legendary musician and a beauty queen raising a family in Miami's sunshine. But behind the photographs lay years of storms, arguments, and silent sacrifices. Fame took Barry far from home, to studios, hotels, and stadiums that swallowed months of his life. Linda was left to hold the line, raising 5 children while cameras chased her husband. She drove the kids to school, cooked dinners, mended scraped knees, all while watching her husband's face on magazine covers. There were moments when the distance nearly broke them. Linda, weary of nights alone, once told Barry she would not stand by if fame destroyed their family. Barry, shaken, chose her. "We argued, of course," he admitted later, "but Linda never gave up on me." Linda's devotion was not passive, it was active, fierce. When Barry teetered on the edges of the same temptations that had consumed Andy, she drew the line. "Not in this house," she told him, shutting the door on the poisons of the industry. In later years, Barry would confess, "Linda saved my life. She had no spotlight, no stage, but she fought for him harder than any crowd ever could." And then came the years of loss. Andy in 1988, Maurice in 2003, Robin in 2012. Each death threatened to crush Barry. After Robin's funeral, witnesses recall Barry returning home to Miami, sitting in silence with his guitars lining the wall, unable to play a note. It was Linda who found him, who wrapped her arms around the man the world thought unbreakable, and whispered, "You are not alone." In that moment, her love was not just comfort, it was resurrection. Their children grew up watching this resilience. Stephen, the eldest, followed his father into music, even touring alongside him in later years, proof that the family's song still carried on. The others chose quieter lives, anchored by Linda's insistence that fame should never steal their childhood. For Barry, this was Linda's greatest gift. Not just her love, but the stability she gave their children, the one thing he himself had never known in his youth. Cinematic moments defined their bond. Barry stepping off a plane after months away to find Linda waiting with their children, arms open. Quiet dinners where music was set aside for laughter. Nights on their veranda where Barry strummed a guitar softly, and Linda's hand rested over his, steady as ever. Through every storm, Linda Gray was his harbor. Through every death, she was his survival. Fame gave Barry the world, but Linda gave him the one thing the world could never offer: a home, a family, and the unshakable truth that love, when fought for, can outlast even the cruelest fate. But even Linda's steady love could not shield him from the weight of time and grief. For Barry, the greatest battles were no longer on the stage. They were inside his own body and within the quiet chambers of his mind. By the early 1990s, the cracks began to show. Decades of relentless touring, sleepless nights in the studio, and the crushing burden of carrying not only his own destiny, but that of his brothers had left scars deeper than applause could heal. Arthritis crept into his joints, twisting his hands, the very hands that had written more than 1,000 songs. The pain spread to his back, his legs, his shoulders, until even strapping on a guitar became an ordeal. In 1994, the Bee Gees were forced to cancel a tour. For fans, it was a disappointment. For Barry, it was humiliation. "I couldn't do it," he admitted quietly, almost as if confessing a sin. The man who had once ignited stadiums now struggled to stand an hour without agony. But his body was only half the battlefield. Inside, Barry was unraveling, each loss carved at him like a blade. Andy in 1988, Maurice in 2003, Robin in 2012. Survivor's guilt wrapped around him like chains. "Why me?" he whispered in interviews, eyes wet with tears. There were nights when he sat alone in silence, unable to touch a guitar, unable even to bear hearing a Bee Gees song on the radio. Once, he confessed that he thought about leaving music behind forever. "I sometimes thought there was no reason to keep going," he said, his voice breaking. Fame had given him everything, yet taken even more. And then came the cruelest echo of all. Severe stomach pains sent him to the hospital, and doctors warned of a dangerous intestinal blockage. Barry froze. It was the same shadow that had stolen Maurice overnight. As he lay under the blinding lights of the operating room, signing the consent for surgery, his hands trembled, not from arthritis, but from terror. He whispered to Linda, "I can't go the way Maurice did." For hours, he drifted between memory and fear. The sterile clang of instruments, the mask descending over his face, the haunting thought that he might not wake. When he finally opened his eyes again, Linda was there, holding his hand, her tears wetting his fingers. He had survived, but the fear never left. From then on, every ache, every cough felt like a reminder that fate might be coming for him too. Even his gift, the falsetto that had changed popular music, turned fragile. Notes that once soared effortlessly now wavered. In rehearsals, he would stop mid-phrase, his face etched with frustration, searching for the voice that had once been unstoppable. To the world, he remained Sir Barry Gibb, knighted and revered. But in the mirror, he saw a man wondering if time had finally stolen his miracle. And yet, Barry endured. He clung to small rituals, morning walks along Miami's shoreline, letting the sea remind him that life still moved forward, light exercises to keep his joints alive. Afternoons in his studio where pain briefly gave way to melody. Linda remained his anchor, gently reminding him that the scars on his hands, the stiffness in his back, even the tremble in his voice were not weaknesses, but proof of survival. His children and grandchildren surrounded him with laughter, pulling him back from the abyss. "Music is therapy," Barry said. "It's how I keep going." And in those words lay his truth. His life had been marked by fire, betrayal, and unbearable loss. Now it was marked by the slow betrayal of his own body. To the crowd, the applause still thundered. But inside, Barry carried the heaviest truth, that survival itself is sometimes the hardest battle, and perhaps the most heroic. Now, at 79 in the year 2025, Barry Gibb lives not for applause, but as the guardian of a legacy forged in both harmony and heartbreak. His fortune, estimated at more than $140 million, is anchored in one of the most valuable music catalogs in history. The Bee Gees' timeless songs, a body of work still streaming, spinning, and selling across generations. The catalog alone is said to generate tens of millions annually, making it not only a monument of art, but a financial empire. His primary residence is a waterfront mansion on Miami Beach's North Bay Road, valued in the tens of millions, surrounded by palm trees, private docks, and glass walls opening to views of Biscayne Bay. The estate is less a palace of excess than a sanctuary of peace for a man who once lived beneath the blinding glare of disco lights. Over the years, he has also owned a beach house in Sydney, a home in Los Angeles, and an estate in England, but Miami has become his refuge. His garage reflects the same blend of luxury and nostalgia. A Rolls-Royce, a Bentley Continental, a Range Rover, and several vintage convertibles, reminders of a youth spent at the wheel of music history. Beyond real estate and cars, Barry treasures his collection of guitars, platinum records, and rare memorabilia, the tangible echoes of a career that sold more than 220 million records worldwide. Yet wealth has never been his truest measure. Barry has also given back. In 2012, he and Linda staged a benefit concert that raised more than $1 million for the Diabetes Research Institute in honor of Andy, a cause that has remained close to his heart. Over the years, he has quietly supported disaster relief, children's health programs, and animal welfare charities, rarely seeking headlines for his generosity. Today, Barry lives quietly with Linda, his wife of more than 5 decades, the partner who steadied him through fame's storms and never let him slip into the same darkness that claimed his brothers. Around them, the family they built has flourished. Their eldest son, Stephen, became a guitarist and songwriter in his own right, once touring with his father and carving a place in rock music with bands of his own. Ashley and Travis both found careers in music as well, carrying forward the family's creative fire, while Michael pursued a path outside the spotlight. Their youngest, Alexandra, grew up shielded from the harshest edges of fame, but remains deeply close to her father. Together, they have given Barry and Linda grandchildren who now run through the halls of the Miami home, filling it with the very sound that once defined the Bee Gees: laughter, rhythm, and harmony. Barry often says his greatest joy today is not in platinum records, but in watching his grandchildren discover music for themselves. His health bears the scars of time, arthritis in his hands and back, a falsetto more fragile than before, but he endures with morning walks by the water, light exercises, and long afternoons in his home studio, where writing songs still feels like therapy. He appears rarely in public, but when he does, whether standing tall at the Kennedy Center Honors in 2023 or quietly guiding the upcoming Bee Gees biopic as executive producer, he reminds the world that his presence, though gentler, still carries weight. For Barry, family is no longer just the brothers who once stood beside him on stage. It is Linda, the children, and the grandchildren who now surround him, ensuring that the harmony of the Gibb legacy is never truly silenced. What endures most is not only the music, but the meaning behind it. Barry Gibb is more than the last surviving Bee Gee. He is the last witness to a harmony that once belonged to 4 voices. He has buried 3 brothers and a mother, each loss carving scars deeper than applause could ever heal. And yet, he still sings. He still carries the sound of a family torn apart by fate, but forever united in song. It is here that his story holds its truest lesson, that no fortune, no fame, not even the knighthood bestowed upon him by a queen, can compare to the fragile, irreplaceable gift of love and family. Barry once said, "I feel like the last leaf on the tree." To the world, it sounded like survival. To him, it was a confession of loneliness. And yet, in that solitude lies his greatest legacy. He proves that survival is not only endurance, it is testimony. Every Bee Gees song that plays is not just a melody, but a remembrance of brothers who once stood together, a family that gave the world harmony born of struggle and love. And as long as Barry breathes, that harmony endures, not as 3 voices, not as 4, but as one man carrying them all. So when you hear Stayin' Alive, How Deep Is Your Love, or To Love Somebody, you are not only hearing pop history, you are hearing the echo of devotion, the price of survival, and the triumph of a man who turned scars into song. That is the true wealth Barry Gibb carries, and it will outlast even time itself. If his voice ever carried you through a lonely night, if his words ever healed a quiet wound in your soul, press like and leave a heart in the comments. Let it be a chorus of love, a tribute that shows Barry's music still lives within us all.